Hello, my name's Stephen Gorad. I'm talking to you about conducting education research. And in my new book, Conducting Education Research, there is a chapter on collecting structured information, as would normally be done through a survey questionnaire. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. Now, obviously, I can't give you all the details that would be in a complete chapter of the book, just give you some ideas and so on to perhaps interest you in improving your questionnaires, improving your surveys, and so on. Okay, so in the book, I take the view which is slightly different to traditional views, that there isn't a fundamental difference in the nature of the information you might want to collect when you go out into the field. It's more about the level of structure there is in the data. So when you're talking about, say, a questionnaire survey, then you're dealing towards the more structured end. But as you'll see, you can have structured and unstructured elements at the same time. So one of the largest studies I ever did, which is in my book, Creating a Learning Society, involves something like 1,100 interviews with householders in their houses. But it was relatively structured, and I was able to do some structured analysis, as well as obviously getting all of their quotations and their stories from those individuals, and they were fascinating. But it made me realize that it's more about the structure of the data rather than the way in which it's collected. So, for example, over time, I've done very inclusive, assisted, small-scale work, but with clearly surveys, but where you're dealing with perhaps with children who have some learning challenges, and you can't simply give them a survey. You have to sit with them and go through stuff. So it was done face to face. It had many of the elements of an interview, but it was heavily structured because it was part of a survey where there were other respondents who didn't have these challenges. Then there was, there's heavily structured stuff about, for example, the nature of feedback, which I've done. So probably I've done tens, if not 30,000 and so on, surveys over time. And what I want to do is give you some advice on perhaps what to do and what not to do. So really today it's just about some craft tips. So here we go. First of all is thinking about the nature of the sample. If you're going to do a survey, a structured collection of data, go big. Make it as big as you possibly can. Work out what you think you're going to do and then double it, whatever. It doesn't really make any difference to the cost of the research or the time, because obviously with structured data, you can allow many people to complete the information themselves. You can put stuff on a website. You can use software which is dedicated to delivering surveys to people and so on. And it's important that you have large numbers, particularly if you're going to look at subgroups. If you want to know whether this kind of respondent or that kind of respondent had different responses, then you need large groups for each of the subgroups, not just overall. So go for a big sample. I mean, that's a theme in all research. Basically, the bigger, the better. Be sure before you do this that the data you're collecting is not already available somewhere else. And that can be the whole data, or even some of the data you want to collect. I mean, I get these all the time in my work. It's really annoying where people email me and say, "Hi, Stephen Gorad, can you fill in this survey? Or can you fill in this form for bureaucracy?" And the first question is, what's your name? And the second question is, what's your email address and so on. You say, well, you already know that. You've written to me here. I mean, that's a trivial example, but you take my point. Don't ask people stuff that you already know. So if you've gone to a school to deliver a questionnaire, or you've emailed it to a school, you know the name of the school. So don't ask what's the name of the school. You can record that somewhere already. So don't ask stuff that you know already. You're just basically adding the burden on your participants, and that is unethical. So try and make it as easy as possible for them. But also make sure that people can actually answer. I mean, answer correctly. You'll find a lot of people will be willing to fill in questionnaires because they treat them like those kind of things on magazines or websites about, what's your personality, or, the kind of things you might fill in for fun with your friends, where the answers don't really matter. But you're doing research and you want the answers to matter. Now, then the answers will never matter as much, or very rarely matter as much to the people responding as they will to you, the researcher. But you want to try and get them to take it seriously. So if you're asking them loads of really silly questions about things that they can't really tell, they'll answer anyway. which is more important, this or that, and they don't know. They'll tell you. And you might try and then treat that as serious data, but make sure that they can make an informed choice. Make sure you're not excluding the comparisons you want to make. So, for example, if your concern was with what difference attending school makes, if you deliver your questionnaire to schools, then you're going to exclude the people who are not attending school. So your natural comparator between the people who attend school is with people who don't attend school. So although it's more annoying to have to try and find the people who are not attending school, it's more convenient to go through the school. You've got to try and find a way of including the groups that are otherwise hard to find. Right? There's a kind of lazy approach to research that just focuses on the group that people are interested in. So they're studying, I don't know, the education of homeless people. They will talk only to homeless people and not to non-homeless people to see if the stories are any different. And this is so widespread that people don't even notice. But make sure that you can include the people who should be in the study. And that's why, going back to the idea of helping children with learning challenges, you know, if you're trying to assess the impact of a literacy intervention on reading ability, if your questionnaire has to be read by the respondents, you're excluding the people who can't read. They might make it look as though the literacy intervention was more effective because all the people who fill in the questionnaire must, by definition, be able to read. But you could arrange for someone else, a teaching assistant or yourself, to help face-to-face someone who could not read fill in and answer their questions, because they will be really, really valuable as part of the research. So don't exclude your natural comparators. Sometimes, you know, you will need to disguise the purpose of your questionnaire. Now, I don't think this is unethical. Sometimes you have to disguise the purpose of your research. Now, ethics boards and so on always want you to make it clear to everybody concerned what's going on in the research. But sometimes that's just not possible, and you can phrase it in a way that is legitimate. So here's an example of a study, not a questionnaire, but we were looking at an intervention called writing about values. The idea was this is a kind of self-affirmation intervention where, for disadvantaged students, before they take a high-stakes test, ask them to write about something that they value about themselves. And there's some evidence that that produces a slightly better result for their high stakes test. They just feel better about themselves and so on. But it only works if they're not aware that that's what's going on. They have to simply fill it in. So what you'd have to do is what we did in our study was to ask people to write an essay about values. And half of them were given an envelope saying, write about yourself. And some people were asked what they valued in other people. So it wasn't entirely clear what was going on when people did it. They didn't know that there was this experimental group who was going to be asked to write about themselves to help them improve their performance in a high-stake test. And I think overall, because of the beneficial purpose of the study, it is completely ethical. So in the same way, if you really want to find something out in a survey, sometimes you can't make it entirely clear what your main interest is. And I'll give you two recent examples. We were interested recently in ethnic minority teachers in England and the issues they face and so on, and why they're underrepresented. So overrepresented in some areas and underrepresented in others. So, for example, there are more white and more Black Caribbean teachers than the same proportion of students, and there are many fewer, say, Chinese or Indian teachers than there would be, given the number of Chinese and Indian students. And we wanted to try and find out about problems that teachers might face, barriers in terms of getting employment, you know, leaving the profession and so on. But instead of writing a question that says, this is about your ethnicity and the barriers you face, we wrote the questionnaire about, well, these are the experiences of school. You know, why did you choose the school? And we asked all teachers, all classroom teachers about this, rather than focusing on the ethnicity issue. And the ethnicity questions came later on in the survey. So we'd established what problems people had faced and so on. So we wanted to see whether Black and Chinese students, teachers were saying different things about why they chose a school or why they might leave the profession. Because if you don't do that, then people will tend to bias their results to try and give you what they think you want. Another recent example was we wanted to find out about why there are shortages of teachers, and we wanted to find out why people did or didn't choose to become a teacher. And most research on why people become teachers asks teachers or people who are training to be teachers why they want to be teachers. And the problem with that is that's only a subset. Surely the most important people that you want to know about are the people who are not intending to be teachers. What would make them become teachers? Why didn't they want to become teachers? But we didn't want to ask people about teaching only. So we wrote a questionnaire which was about career choice and said, well, what kind of factors would influence your choice of what career you want? And then we said, and would you be willing to become a teacher? Because then we can then say, well, the people who want to become teachers valued this in a career, and the people who didn't wanted this, rather than telling them this is all about teachers at the beginning. I hope you take my point. You don't always want to tell people exactly what you're trying to find out, but you can ask them a wider or broader questions and so on. There's too much of this focus on only one group and only one topic in questionnaires. I think we need to broaden it out a bit. Okay, some more specific tips if you're developing a questionnaire. We've already said make sure that people can respond. I don't just mean that they know the answer to the questions. There's something they could tell you about. I mean, make sure they can actually access the material. So there's a useful piece of software that will give you a FLESH readability index. So it's FLESCH, the FLESH readability index. So you can just simply paste in your questionnaire or parts of your questionnaire, and the software will tell you what the average reading age is for that piece of work. So you can see whether the people of the age group or the education level that you're trying to talk to or trying to ask questions of could address, I can understand the questions and answer them and so on. I would always do that before sending out a questionnaire, as well, of course, asking other people to have a look. But if you're, for example, if you're a PhD student and you ask all your friends who are PhD students or your educated family, they're going to be able to read and understand stuff. What you really want is to ask people who are the typical participant or maybe the weaker participants in your study, if they can understand. Don't ask your research questions this goes beyond the being wider or broader. I mean, this is how insane is this? I've seen, this is a genuine example. Somebody wanted to find out whether most teachers believed something or other to be true. So that was their research question. So what they did in their questionnaire was they asked teachers, do most teachers believe something or other to be true? They just completely misunderstood the point of research. What they're trying to do, what they should have done, is to ask each teacher, a lot of teachers, do you think this is true? And then they, the researcher, aggregate the results to say whether most teachers do or do not believe it to be true. Right? Now, that's an obvious example, and I hope you can see how stupid that is. But many researchers do something very similar. They basically think, I don't know the answer to this research question. And then they go and ask that question to other people. Has this new policy in schools worked? Let's go and ask head teachers whether they think it's worked. That's not research, that's journalism. And we don't want that. In terms of how you structure your questionnaire, there is this pressure to have more and more information at the outset. And I think that's really problematic because it puts people off. It seems bureaucratic, it seems overly legal, and it's also very dull for the person responding. You have asked people, will you respond to this questionnaire? And they said yes, or they've agreed to open it up and have a look at it. What you want to do is take them first to a really exciting bit. You want to take them to whatever the topic is about that they've agreed to talk about. So if you've said, do you want to tell me your experiences of bullying in school? And they're keen to tell you about it. Don't make the first questions about do they consent or what's their background or what's their educational level. Go straight into the nitty gritty about bullying because that's what they've agreed. If later on you want to ask them, are you male or female? What's your sexuality? Whatever. Then you can ask those questions and the momentum will probably take them through. But also, if they get bored with the questionnaire and they stop at the end, if they've told you their experiences of bullying or not, you can use that information, even if you haven't got the background information. But if you just have the background information and they got so bored doing that, they stopped and told you nothing about bullying, you can't use that information at all. Yeah. I would not have repetition. I would not use so-called Likert scales. You know, these scales where people agree from, strongly disagree to strongly agree, between agree and disagree. The problem with these is they are not numeric scales and they will be really hard to assess. So they're neither giving you rich data about people's reasons for agreement, nor are they an easy scale to use. So the problem with Likert scales is that they're not numeric and they're not therefore a measurement that you can use. You can't do most statistical or numeric analysis with them, even though people pretend they can. You're much better off to use an actual scale by saying to people, can you score out of 10 how much you agree with this or how much you enjoy this thing, rather than these I strongly agree or strongly disagree type scales. You're not getting rich data from these scales, but nor are you getting a clear measurement. So I can't understand why they're so popular. I wouldn't use them. Don't have double-barreled questions. That is, don't have questions that ask two things at once. What is your experience of bullying and why do you think it happens? Separate them out into the clear, theoretical components, and don't have two-dimensional answers and things like that. Ideally, you don't want branches in your questionnaire. What I mean is you don't want bits that some people answer and some people don't. So you say, if you answered yes to question 8, then go to question 10B or whatever. So although if you're doing this on software and completing a question online, although these branches would be invisible, what it means at the end is you've got responses to some items, but not others. And that reduces the number of cases in your study, quite often quite heavily. You can normally rephrase any question that you're thinking of branching into a question that everybody can answer. You might have a, rate this is 0 if it's not relevant, or a tick a box that says none of the above apply or something. I'm sure you can imagine a way of doing it in which you can cut all of that out. It's important to offer people alternatives. Normally with questionnaires, you will have pre-coded responses and people will tick a box, yes or no or maybe, whatever it is. Give people an alternative option. Normally it's other and then please specify, and they can write in. And that's important because although most people might be able to find an answer among the ones that you've pre-imagined and pre-coded, you don't want to cut out the idiosyncratic, the interesting, the illuminating responses. Let people tell you what their answer is. And therefore, even in a structured questionnaire, you need plenty of white space, boxes where people can tell you stuff and encourage them to do so. Most people won't fill anything in, but you can get some really interesting stuff that people will add comments and so on in the questionnaire. So do that. And consider a variety of questions. On the one hand, you want to have questions that are similar and the scales are similar as you go through it, so people don't have to keep adjusting to think, oh, what am I trying to say here? How do I score this? How do I rate this? How do I tick this box? So try and make them as similar as possible. You can rephrase most questions into something like, how much do you agree with this statement? But sometimes these approaches will constrain. Yes, having the other please specify in the boxes of stuff they can comment on will help. But I found a really interesting way is to use what are called vignettes. So these are little stories. So instead of saying, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? It's saying, here's a situation, here's a story, a real life story about whatever the topic is. It might be about bullying. And then you have some options about what would you do under these circumstances? You're the teacher and you observe this child doing this or doing that. What would you do about it? And there are not so clearly demand on right answers. If you say people, is it a good idea to be good or whatever, they know that you're supposed to say, yes, you are supposed to be good or something. But when you ask people with vignettes about how would you behave under certain circumstances, it's not entirely clear what the correct or desirable, socially desirable answer is. And you can get some really interesting responses. And I found some, I think, really important findings in an international study using kind of it. I won't have time to talk about it now. However you structure your questions, you must consider how to analyze the answers. I'm sick and tired of people coming up to me and saying, I've done a questionnaire, I've got my responses, can you tell me how to analyze them? And I said, well, what did you think you were going to do when you answered the question? You must, I mean, ideally, you actually collect information, genuine information, and analyze it, even if it's only for a few cases. So as with most aspects of research, you should pilot it, seriously pilot it, the whole thing. Don't just pilot whether people can read the questionnaire and whether you can contact schools or parents or whatever to fill it in. Pilot the whole thing, including the analysis, because it's only when you do the analysis you realize how difficult it is to deal with double-barrel questions or Likert scales or whatever. So pilot, test everything, check it with other people. I know there's this sort of urge to develop the question and get it out there and get on with it. There's an impatience to it, but really try and get other people to look at it, try and get people to try it out. I think that's really important. So those are just a few tips. There are many more in the book, and I hope you'll have a look at them and you'll enjoy them and appreciate them in your work. But yeah, so do all that. Make the questionnaire exciting for the kind of people that you want to respond to it. Don't make it a dull bureaucratic exercise. Don't make it very long, and refresh it with things like vignettes, exciting little stories, which are non-threatening because they're not about the person. They're not about me, the respondent. They're about somebody else. Okay, see you next time.